Hello everybody and welcome back to the Galactic Armory. Today we've got something special for you. We're going to be showing you from start to finish how we printed, molded, and casted these DC-17 pistols. Got Jamie here with me. He's going to help us explain the whole process from start to finish.
Hey folks.
So let's go ahead and jump right into it. First, we have our master here. And what exactly is this, Jamie?
So this was a single piece resin printed blaster. I believe it was printed on the Elegoo Jupiter.
Yeah, Elegoo Jupiter is a massive machine. A bit tricky to dial in at first, but I was able to get one good, mostly solid print of this blaster. We took off the little dial piece on the backside just to help separate it out, make casting easier for us.
Now, whilst this created a near perfect mold, where contacts had to be peeled off, usually that results in some little divots, slight warping. There is issues and drain holes and little matters that you'll see across the entire blaster that need to be dealt with before we want to cast this, because any imperfections that are on this master mold will be seen.
They'll come out exactly as they are on the master. There's no filling or anything like that from the silicone. It will make an exact copy. So how are we going to fill those drain holes?
So with that in mind, I typically like to use some cotton swabs. These cotton swabs will fill the gap just enough, apply pressure, and then using a photoreactive UV resin, those cotton swabs will soak up that resin, and then when hit with a UV light, they'll just instantly harden, almost crystallize, and will fill and join those drain holes.
It works really well because essentially you're filling those holes with more of what the material already is, what the blaster is already made of.
Exactly. So it will fill in and join and make a perfect seal that can then be filed down, sanded over, and then you're ready to start dealing with all of those little divots and imperfections that you'll see.
Right. When I sliced up the print for the resin printer, some of the supports came in contact with the little knurling on the grip. And so you had to kind of manually and tediously repair those, in a sense.
I would say painstakingly.
Yeah, that's another word for it.
I use just standard Bondo like we do with most of our processes and a toothpick and just placed a small drop of Bondo in each of those little holes and then cleared the entire back and tried to remold the back of the blaster where most of the contacts were with that Bondo. And as you see here, whilst there's a good amount of Bondo, most of the blaster came out absolutely perfectly.
So once we have the Bondo hardened and ready to sand, what are you going to do that with?
So I like to get all of those drain holes filed away with a sanding drum on a small personal hand-sized Dremel. That means I'm not taking away too much material. That'll get rid of just the bulk of that material. Then I go on to a 220 grit sandpaper. That will make sure I'm not, again, taking too much material away. I'm not creating gouges or scratches on the surface. And I'll gradually build up the grit from there and get it smoother and smoother so that it is good enough for a mass production.
Is that handheld Dremel a little bit less powerful than one you'd have to, say, plug in the wall or something?
Yeah, exactly. It allows me to sand down material but not hog away material.
Not hawk it off.
Yeah, exactly. And as you see, I had to get very detailed with ensuring that this knurling remained. So I had to get a microscope, pretty much.
Yeah, a little magnifying
a
glass.
magnifying glass to make sure that I placed that knurling back onto it that might have been filled up with Bondo just using a scalpel.
I could see how that would be painstaking. That seemed strainful on the eyes.
Yes, emphasis on the pain. And so to make sure that I kept the curve of the back of the handle of the grip, I make sure to use a detail file sander band, which is just a long strip of pretty rough sandpaper, and I'll cut that band open so I can then almost polish the Bondo off using that sandpaper. And it allows the curve to naturally form on the back of the blaster. I was really satisfied with the finish.
That's a good way to do that. Sometimes when you're hand sanding, you can go too far in the same direction and you kind of create a little flat spot. Definitely want to avoid that on this blaster.
And so bit by bit, you see that we're getting closer to a perfectly smooth, perfectly finished master prop. We want to make sure that any spots that we missed are made obvious, so we'll just coat it with a gray neutral primer just to catch any of those imperfections before we dedicate a mold to it. And once we're satisfied, we're going to do our usual process of getting a high grit sandpaper and wet sanding this. That'll allow us to get this super smooth, looking like machined metal, and a nice even coat, and catch any microscopic surface imperfections.
And we cannot stress it enough that your master needs to be flawless. When we move forward to actually creating the mold and starting that whole process, you won't be able to see the finished blaster until you're already like 2 feet all the way in on this. The silicone is not cheap, and so we want to make sure that our master is perfect.
Yeah, what isn't shown here is that whilst you see one of each part of this process, I have done this several times in each section.
There's a lot of behind the scenes work that is not included on camera, but this covers all the steps.
And once we are done with all of that and we're satisfied, we are left with a, as close as possible to perfect,
that is
master blaster.
Absolutely beautiful. But it's made out of resin, or an SLA resin, so it's very brittle. Like if you were to drop this on the concrete floor, it would probably shatter and splinter.
Crack into.
So you want to be very careful when you're handling this. But when we cast the blaster in a polyurethane resin, it's vastly going to improve the durability from this master. So now that we have our master blaster perfected, we need to mold this thing. Now, we're going to be doing a 2-part mold. That means we are going to mold half of the blaster first, and then the other half separately after that. Jamie, why do we need to do it as a 2-part mold?
Because there's a lot of details that you see along both sides, and it's a complex shape, so it's difficult to make a glove mold or some sort of matrix mold. We also want to make sure that any seam lines are in very obvious, easy places that people can sand down, and get all of the detail, especially the knurling on the grip, on both sides.
So what's the first step of this 2-part mold?
You want to make sure that you have a nice solid base, and this will basically enable you to see what your final mold shape will be. You want to make sure that you have about 1.5 inches, if not more, around the entire perimeter of this piece. Now, that means that the perimeter will result in how much silicone you'll be able to use, and that has a dollar value to it, so make sure it matches as much as possible. So once you have your board ready, get a load of modeling clay. Now this stuff is a slow dry and really soft water-based clay. Also recommend an oil-based clay that won't dry out on you and stick to everything. Mm-hmm. So what we do is we make sure that everything is basically pinned into shape right in the middle of the board with just lumps of clay, and we want to gradually start building that up so that exactly 1/2 of the blaster, the bottom half of the blaster, is entirely encased in clay. Right. And where this clay lines up will be where our mold line will be.
Yes, so this top half of the blaster that you can still see, this is the half that we are currently molding. The bottom half, when we get to it, we're going to remove that clay and then get to that side. But right now we're focusing on this top side, but we need to plan ahead a little bit. There are some curves of the blaster that we want to work around so that it's easier and
less destructive.
Mm-hmm.
So
capture those details.
Exactly. It'll capture those details, and it will ensure that when you are sanding off any mold lines, you don't have to go into deep areas or potentially ruin some nice details. Once you're sure that the surface is entirely smooth, that you are satisfied with the finish, and you're satisfied that the entire perimeter of the blaster is molded right to the surface with clay.
Right. It needs to be totally sealed.
Exactly. Once you're happy with that, you make sure that you place a box, in this case a foam core board, around the entire outside of this box, of this mold surface, so that you are able to pre-plan the height, or I should say the depth of the silicone that you'll need.
These are the walls that are going to keep the silicone in place. You want to make sure that all of the corners are well glued together, very well reinforced. If this foam core separates, the silicone is going to just pour out everywhere. You're going to have a huge mess and waste a whole lot of material.
And let's be frank, that'll be hundreds of dollars of wasted material.
Yeah, it's not cheap at all.
And when we're satisfied that everything is nice and secure, we want to make sure that there's no gaps along the perimeter wall. So just add more clay, get into all those surfaces, and just make sure that, and I cannot stress this enough, there are no leaks. So when we have that ready to go, we just want to make sure that we pre-plan our pore hole, get some air spouts ready so that when we are starting to cast this, we know exactly where to cut out pore holes in the future. And now that requires a lot of pre-planning, because you need to know where and how this will pour, what direction this will pour, and as such, where air will go inside the mold.
We're going to be touching up on it later in the video, but we're going to be pouring the liquid from the barrel tip up to that grip. So air is going to rise from there, and you can see we have a little air channel near the dial and a pour channel near the bottom of the grip. So be mindful of where that air is going to go. If it can't go anywhere, it's going to result in air pockets and air bubbles in your casts, which you want to avoid.
And now, to make sure that there are no lateral movements when you have two parts of a mold, we just like to make sure that there's some registration keys, or a lot of registration keys, across this whole thing. Now, this is quite a flat, thick mold, so we want to make sure that there is plenty of registration so that there's no slippage in the bottom, that everything is kept together and held together very well to make sure our seam lines are as fine and non-intrusive as possible.
Once those two halves of the silicone are cured, they are not going to want to stick to anything, so you kind of have to force them to be held into place with those registration keys.
And once we are happy with how those registration keys look, we'll have to make sure that this box is nicely reinforced so that it doesn't bow out when the silicone is applied. And once we are finished with that, we apply everything with a liberal coating of ease release, because we do not want the silicone to stick to any of this.
Just make the silicone come off easier without affecting the master mold too much. It's just basically a very thin coat of aerosolized sealant. So we're ready to mix some silicone. What kind of silicone are we going to be using?
So we're going to be using Smooth On Rebound 25. Now, this is a platinum silicone, which literally means it has platinum inside the silicone. It is a high quality, high detail casting silicone.
And it's known for its durability as well, right? So it's going to last you quite a while.
Hopefully. And once we have calculated around about how much silicone that we need, which in this case, you have to measure out the volume, which is height, width, and depth, I believe.
A little bit of mathematics here.
Yeah. And then recommended by many people in Smooth On and other master mold makers for Hasbro, you multiply that number by 18.5.
It's very specific.
It is very specific. Apparently that is the key number to figure out how much silicone that you need to fill a specific area. And that is in inches times 18.5.
It's good to note as well that the silicone is a two-part mixture. So however much silicone you need total, divide that by 2 for your 2 halves.
Exactly. So we are ready to start pouring the silicone after we do one more step, which is degassing it.
Right. This is a very important step. After you have mixed the 2 halves of silicone together, there's a lot of air bubbles in there. And air bubbles are just the enemy of casting. We want to remove them any way possible. So what we're going to do is put the mixed silicone in this vacuum chamber. We put it in there. We've got a motor attached to it. It actually sucks the air out of that silicone, removing any air bubbles in the process. As the pressure begins to drop, you will see the silicone begin to rise and turn almost spongy. That's just part of the process. If you see the silicone approach the capacity of the container, you can let a little bit of air back in. That should let it sink back down, and then let it continue to remove that air as it rise back up. Eventually, it will cavitate in on itself as it cannot support its own weight. That's how you know all of the air bubbles have been removed.
And once it's collapsed in on itself, then you make sure to pour in at the deepest part of the mold, wherever possible. That will allow the silicone to gradually reach in and degas itself wherever possible.
You're also doing kind of a high pour so that it's a very thin stream by the time the mold hits the blaster. So any remaining air bubbles should be escaped at that point.
And just to make sure of that, we finish up this entire mold half with hitting it with a heat gun, which will draw out any of that last surface bubbling and will help to pop it. And now we make sure to leave that for at least 8 hours, in our case, overnight.
But by then, that silicone should be cured. It should be hardened. And if you mixed it well, it should be totally uniform in color. So once that silicone has fully cured, we will start to remove all that clay, right?
Yeah, so what we do is we just take off those walls, and that will expose the clay, and we need to very carefully, and I can't emphasize this enough, very carefully remove that clay because we do not want to dislodge that blaster.
Right, that blaster's got to stay in the silicone for this second half of the mold.
Yeah, so we'll take that off, and that will no doubt leave a lot of excess clay on the surface. We like to use a silicone clay tool with a little bit of water, and we'll just take our time and gradually remove all of that detritus, all of those little chunks of clay until it's completely clean. And we're ready to repeat the entire process on the other side, rebuilding those walls, securing the whole thing, applying a layer of ease release, and pouring the second half of the mold.
I'd say the ease release is very important for the second half. Otherwise, the silicone will want to bond to the other side of the silicone. That ease release is going to help prevent that.
And whilst that silicone is curing, I just make sure to repeat this entire process, but on a miniature scale. In this case, working on the small disc greebly that will attach to the back of the blaster. So this board doesn't need to be as strong as the previous one. It just needs to basically hold the greebly and the foam core in place, but it's quite porous. So I want to make sure that the silicone does not bond to this board. So I'll just apply some sonite wax, a couple layers of that, and that will fill in those pores and allow the mold to be released really easily once it is cured.
Yeah, you might not be able to see it, but that wood is just full of divots and pores, which that silicone will find its way into and make itself quite difficult to remove.
And with that greebly in place and on the walls ready to go, we just do a really quick pour, a really small batch, and that will just allow us to quickly cast that back disc that attaches to all of our nearly ready blasters.
Right, that's a much simpler piece to work on. I'm sure you're happy for that.
Absolutely.
So once the other side of the silicone has cured, we are ready to take this thing apart.
And this is the scariest moment of the entire process.
Yes.
We want to make sure that there are no gaps, no bubbles, the seam line is nice and secure. And so we gradually, very gradually, without damaging any of the registration keys or damaging the mold itself, we gradually peel off the two halves and make sure that we have a nice negative in both cavities with no air bubbles.
Did have to trim away a little bit around the edge with an X-Acto knife. Just a little bit of flashing between the two pieces, but you definitely want to be careful taking it apart. You don't want to rip it apart. So here are the two parts of the mold. You can see that you have dug out that pour channel by the bottom of the grip. That is where we're going to be pouring in the resin.
The back of this blaster will be pointed up when it is being casted. So that will be the highest point, and it'll be where air wants to escape or collect. So we'll pour through that pour spout, which is the highest point, and then we have air channels at the other highest point, which will allow all of that air to escape, and we'll know when resin starts seeping out of those air spouts that the mold is entirely full.
Ideally completely devoid of air inside.
Ideally. And so we are ready to try our first cast.
This is also a scary step. You find out if it was all worth it, if it all went well. You don't really know until you separate it out. So I'm applying a good first coat of ease release as well. That's going to help protect the mold. As you use the mold, say like a dozen times, parts of the silicone will want to stick together and in some cases tear apart. This ease release helps make sure that once you cast something, it comes out of the silicone mold very easily and very nicely and helps protect that mold and ensure that it has a long lifespan.
And to help that process, we also add a small layer of baby powder, which will just reduce any tension that the silicone has when it is being pulled apart from each other and pulled apart from the blaster that we will be casting in just a moment.
Now the silicone, it's pretty solid, but it's still very wobbly. What you're doing here is putting it in between two wooden boards. That is going to help give it a nice even pressure when we put these elastic bands around. It's going to help keep the silicone in place as well as provide that nice even pressure. If we were to use clamps or something, for example, to hold it together without the wooden board, you would see like impressions of where it moved the silicone or where it pressed on the silicone. And so adding boards to either side evenly distributes that pressure to make sure that there are no divot spots.
And with our mold clamped together, we are satisfied that there will be no gaps and reduced flashing. between the two halves, we are ready to do our first pour.
This is the moment of truth. What are we going to be casting it in?
We're going to use a polyurethane Smooth Cast 65D, which is also by Smooth On, and we're going to use a little bit of So Strong Black, and just a touch of this will dye this entire process mixed into the part B. Once these two halves are mixed, it will dye the finished product in a really strong black without you having to paint it later.
Yeah, that's really nice.
And you might be wondering why this is being poured inside a large bucket. And the reason would be just in case there is any potential leakages for a first time using the mold, that it doesn't just get all over the surface.
This would be the time that you find out.
So once we're satisfied that everything is in, that there is air escaping through the air channels, which you can see through the leaks of small amounts of resin, we wait very patiently to make sure that this cast has been a success.
This resin has a pot life of approximately 3 to 4 minutes, I believe.
Exactly. It has a pot life of upwards to 5 minutes, especially in such a large volume like this in one batch. That heat that it will generate will actually cause itself to cure even faster.
We'll see a little bit of that in the later part of the video. We have something special for you. But after waiting for this resin to cure, we need to take off the bands, take off the wooden boards.
Calm ourselves.
Yes. Center ourselves and prepare to split the silicone, pull off that top half, and see our blaster inside.
And boy, were we happy. Oh, you love to see it.
Now, before we show you the final pull of the blaster from this mold, we wanted to show you just how versatile a good mold can be. And so we're going to be doing something interesting, isn't that right, Jamie?
Well, we couldn't make a blaster without actually wanting to make it out of metal. And we wouldn't really want to make it out of metal without making something more fun.
Right. So we're going to be doing a process called cold casting, which is essentially a way of casting a metal object cold, or as not using a furnace or blast furnace or anything like that. So what we have here is some copper powder. It is very finely grained copper. It weighs a whole lot because it is basically just a bunch of metal flakes. But how are we going to do this? How are we going to make this blaster out of copper?
So the idea is that we are going to cast it in a way that creates a shell of actual metal on the exterior of this blaster. And we're going to do this in a sort of book-like fashion. We're going to cast this in an open method, which will have the two halves of the mold completely open and then have the resin openly poured into it for 2/3 of the total weight. Now, to get that onto the surface, we apply some ease release and then just dust on an entire coat, quite a thick coat, of pure copper.
And that ease release is going to help secure those copper flakes to the exterior edge.
Yeah, but not allow it to permanently bond to our new mold.
Right. So we're going to use the same resin as we did for the normal blaster, except we are going to pour it into these two halves separately at first, making sure that we don't use too much resin to the point where it overflows. We're kind of just doing it, like you said, in thirds. Left third, the right third, and then we'll put these together and form the middle third.
So the reason behind that is to make sure that all of that exterior copper stays exactly where it needs to. Because if we pour this through the pour spout, there is a good chance that that resin will just drag down the copper and we'll have sections that won't have that nice finish.
Right, we'll have little bare spots.
That's right. And you can see here, as I was saying earlier, because of the heat that's being generated by this resin, it will cause itself to, well, the term is kick faster, which will mean it'll instantly harden right in front of your eyes. This is barely sped up footage, and the resin instantly cured.
It really is really cool to watch over and over. It's amazing how fast it cures and how you can just watch it happen before your eyes.
And so once we know that this is cured enough, that means that we will repeat our process of putting the two halves together and ensuring that everything is nicely bound with our straps and with our clamps and the wood exterior block, and we'll pour in that last third.
Okay, and after we've waited for that last third to cure, we can do like we did for the first blaster. We can separate the two halves of silicone and see our very nice blaster underneath.
But it's weird that the finished product at this time will look almost just like plastic. It will just be brown.
It's pretty dull right now.
But what we do to get that finished product is we create a actual polishing process using some quadruple zero Scotch-Brite pad, and that will buff the metal out. It will actually legitimately shine the exterior just like you would some tableware or a candlestick.
Essentially, that's what we have on the exterior shell, is a ideally nice, complete, uniform shell of a very thin layer of copper, but a layer of copper nonetheless. And that layer you can polish to a very bright, reflective surface.
And weather it however you want, creating really cool finished effect. So I like to use a patina method, much like you would see in a statue or something like that, and use some of this blue oxide paint and just dab that on, leave that in the recesses, and you have a really cool, almost Call of Duty skin style for your blaster.
I love it. It really gives, copper will age. It'll turn green with age. And this paint really brought that out. But there you go, guys. That is how we made our DC-17 blaster pistol mold. You can find casts for these in the shop online. Links will be in the description. I am really pleased with how these blasters come out. They are much more durable than a 3D print, much more durable than like a resin print as well. Very shock resistant. They come in 2 parts with the rear disc. The rear disc fits right in with an assembly key. And painting these things is just so much simpler than filling in a 3D print. Isn't that right?
That's right. These molds are pretty much designed to be good to go as soon as you get it. Now, if you want to make it perfect, all you need to do is use the usual methods to get rid of the seam line that you would for any sort of cast, which is a really simple, quick process. And then just apply a nice black coat on it and weather it how you want. You are good to go. So quick compared to a 3D printed piece.
Right. And I mean, you're pretty good right out of the gate with the resin dyed black. It looks like 90% of the way there already. So you've got a nice base to start with on your projects. This base is very durable. It'll last you a long time. It also fits perfectly into our 3D printed holsters. So we like that very much. Well, that's all for now. Remember, you can find links for these pistols in the description below. I hope you enjoyed the video. It was a longer one, but we wanted to go into full detail about the entire process. I know this is something a lot of people have been curious with. So I hope you learned something, and I hope that you're feeling confident enough to take on a project like this yourself. This is a project that you want to take a lot of time with, want to plan everything accordingly. This is a project you don't want to go in just guns blazing. But regardless, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that we see you again in the next one.